evening, everyone. I'm very excited to welcome you to tonight's African American Read-In. Tonight, I'm being joined by June Collins Pulliam. And so I'd like to share a little bit of background about African American Read-In and then introduce our presenter, and then we'll get everything started. And so the National African American Read-In is a groundbreaking effort to encourage communities to read together, centering African American books and authors. It was established in 1990 by the Black Caucus of the National Council of Teachers of English to make literacy a significant part of Black History Month. This initiative has reached more than 6 million participants around the world. Tonight, I'm joined by June Collins Pulliam, and she'll be sharing the works of her late mother, Izola Ethel Fedford Collins, and this will be followed by a Q&A. Izola Ethel Fedford Collins was born in the family home in Galveston, Texas, October 26, 1929, and died June 12, 2017, at the age of 87. She graduated from Central High School at 14 and from Prairie View A&M University at 18. She obtained her master's degree in music from Northwestern University in Illinois. She organized and directed 3 school bands in Texas: Bay City, Hitchcock, and Galveston Catholic. Retiring from Galveston ISD as an award-winning choir instructor, she then was elected citywide to the Galveston ISD Board of Trustees and served for 9 years, the last as president. Ms. Collins has written articles published in Southwestern Musician, Texas Music Educators Association, Fanfare School of Music of Northwestern University, The Story of St. Mary's Hospital, Galveston, and poems in the National Library of Poetry, and is the author of Island of Color, Where Juneteenth Started, and 2 books of poetry, Divine Light Never Goes Away, and I Know That's Right, and a children's book, Pip, Squeak, and Zoom. June Collins Pulliam is Executive Director of Fanfare Lutheran Music Academy, while also maintaining a small part-time music therapy practice. She received her Master's of Arts in Behavioral Sciences from University of Houston Clear Lake and her Bachelor's of Science in Music Therapy from Texas Women's University. In addition to being a board-certified music therapist, she did postgraduate work in psychodrama as a former co-owner of Pulliam Psychotherapy Associates in Houston, also practiced as a certified practitioner of psychodrama, sociometry, and group therapy. Please help me welcome our esteemed community member, guest, and dear friend, Ms. June Collins Pulliam.
Thank you so much, Tarina. I want to thank you and Nia Cultural Center, Executive Director Sue Johnson, for inviting me to do this. It is a great honor to be able to read excerpts from my mother's books, and I know this would have pleased her greatly. It's my goal, if we have enough time, to share a little bit from all 4 of my mother's books, but we'll be spending most of the time with me reading excerpts from the book for which she is best known, Island of Color, Where Juneteenth Started. And so I'd like to start with just a brief part of the acknowledgments that she included in Island of Color, Where Juneteenth Started. And she said, "The very first thank you must go to my creator. Motivation, desire, ability, endurance, tolerance, and interaction with so many wonderful people all came directly from God. From my grandfather, with his vision and wish for a better future, I received a historical account, including his earliest memories and his knowledge of everything in Galveston that had to do with African Americans and their surroundings. Having this in his own handwriting was an added blessing." And she ends that section saying, "Galveston, I love you. Wherever I travel, place I would rather live. You certainly have faults. That's okay. I glory in the fact that here I get smiles and waves from all kinds of people." And so at this time, before I go further, I've asked Tarina to actually share a short video clip. This is from an interview that Ted Ellis, the well-known artist, did with my mother about 8 years ago. And so this clip that hopefully you'll get to see, it's only a minute or 2 long, is actually her introducing to him the book that I'm about to read from this evening.
I'm adding it to the stream now.
Okay.
Sorry, I apologize. It looks like there's something in my permissions that I have to change real quick.
While you're doing that, I'll just share with whoever's watching. This is the original cover for Island of Color that my mother wrote. And then last year, her granddaughter, my daughter, June Pulliam, gave it a new design. And so this is the way it appears now.
I think I might have it now. Let's see. Thank you for being so patient.
And I have some other things I can say if you'd like me to stall a little bit while you do that.
That would be so helpful. Thank you.
Okay. So on the cover of this book, you see actually a photo of our family, and you will hear talk about a man who came here as a 5-year-old child. This is him right here, Reverend Ralph Albert Skull. He arrived here with his grandparents in 1865 when he was 5 years old. And he is the one whose writings my mother was able to use for the years, long before she was born. He had kept a journal about those years. And I'm not sure, Tarina, should I just continue? I think I'm going to just go on, and maybe she'll pull that up a little later. Maybe that would be a good idea. Okay. So one of the things that she does in this book is that she gives a little background to Galveston itself that a lot of people are not aware of. This is an excerpt from the beginnings of her book. As an international port in the latter 19th century, surpassed only by New York City in volume, and merely rivaled by New Orleans in volume and color, if you will, Galveston was the initiator, the source, the parent of much of civilization as it became known in the South. An island smaller in area than New York and not as geographically advantaged as New Orleans, Galveston was still well on her way to world prominence when the great storm of 1900 changed the plan. The very fact that Galveston did survive and continues to is testimony to her tenacity and permanence. Her most devastating physical setbacks included the fire of 1883 and the storms of 1900 and 1915. Much of the city burned to the ground in 1883, and the whole city was rebuilt after the great storm of 1900, which was the nation's worst natural disaster to this day. Tarina, feel free to jump in anytime, but I'll keep going. Do you have that ready?
I hope so. Okay. I'm so sorry I got kicked off.
It's okay.
And we're trying again.
Okay.
I'm going to pull this out and see if it will let me share the screen now.
Okay.
We did it. Wonderful. Okay.
I can't hear it, Tarina. I don't know if other people can.
Okay, let me see. I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
Try to share it again and see if Thank you for being so patient.
I could say that this book
Are you able to hear it?
the life's wonderful work because Island of Color details all of what happened to African Americans in Galveston, where really the culture of our nation started. My grandfather, Ralph Albert Skull, was visionary enough to write down all of the things that happened to him in the time that he lived. And he covered all of the disciplines: education, church, home, medicine, everything, entertainment. And so anybody who wants to know how our culture really started can read this book. And it's not just for African Americans because we are all Americans. Every American needs to know how things started. The first churches of every major denomination started in Galveston, the first high school, the first medical facilities, entertainment facilities. Many people do not know there was a real symphony orchestra right here in Galveston. People who of color played timpani drums. He actually has recorded that. We don't know, just like they knew about fiddler, from which we found that there were many things that people did not know about. So I've attempted not only to go on my grandfather's writings, which he wrote every night in his book after every night. I was able to see him as a child in my home writing every night. But I also went to interview people after his death and after he recorded this, who were over 90 years old. Almost 5 or 6 people were already over 100. And I'm happy to say that they gave me willingly their account of what they remembered about Galveston. There's a lot to say, and I have a little time to say it, but I thank God for my life.
Thank you, Trina. Thank you, Trina. Okay. Thank you for sharing that. I am very thankful that Ted Ellis had the foresight and the desire to get that interview from her. So I thought you all might enjoy hearing her say that in her own words. So from the writings that her grandfather, Reverend Ralph Albert Skull, wrote, she has this excerpt that I'd like to share. When he, having come as a 5-year-old child with his parents in 1865. It was 1865. The awful war was over, and word had come across the water to Port Bolivar of freedom. That's where my great grandparents were living at that time, across Galveston Bay. President Lincoln had sent the order down. These slave owners might not like it, but they had to obey it. Our folk were free to earn their own living, free to go wherever they could, free to join forces with old friends and family. And over there in Galveston, you could find work. You could find things going on. Ships came in with imports from all over the world, and things from all over Texas and neighboring states were exported to places like Paris. Galveston was full of excitement. In spite of the nightmare of shelling and invasion during the war, Galveston had resisted decay. Galveston was a haven, an oasis from grief, and Black people of different nationalities walked the streets. Some of these were free Blacks who spoke Spanish, who had been freed years ago by the Mexican government. Some were dark-skinned people from India with wavy long hair and a language unlike the others. But most were abducted Africans, brought to America to do the hard work that the whites either couldn't or wouldn't do. They had retained no names of their own, but had taken on their captors' surnames and values. But their hearts remembered their faraway heritage and beat to the pulse of the drums of their past culture. My mother imagined what it was like when she was on one particular occasion riding on the ferry herself, going to and from Port Bolivar. She just imagined that trip, that voyage that they made across that same Galveston Bay. Another excerpt that goes on back, referring to those early days. My mother calls this section "Putting Color Back into Earliest Galveston." Most of the pictures taken in the early days of color photography have deteriorated with time. With the color that was once there now faded, the image that remains is a false one. Some historians have omitted the information about Galveston's people of color that they lacked, but a crime has been committed by those who knew the stories and purposely left the heroes of color out. As a port of foreign trade, Galveston's exposure to the wider world gave its residents some natural tolerance for and understanding of varied cultures. People of every race and creed walk the streets. Although others have tried to say otherwise, there has been limited racial conflict here in Galveston since its birth. Estevanico, also sometimes referred to as Esteban, preceded white Spanish explorer Cabeza de Vaca off the boat in 1528, more as partner than slave. And Black slaves in Galveston received legal rights long before the Civil War due to the lobbying of the city's German settlers. In its earliest years, there were slaves, indentured servants of color, and already freed Black people living quietly here. And information is slowly emerging that free people of color enjoyed some measure of citizenship. They built homes, supported this island, and made lasting contributions to Galveston's welfare. An early African-American businessman, Major Carey, who opened the first livery stable in Galveston in 1838, was noted for heroic conduct in the Battle of San Jacinto. Captured runaway Negroes helped build a formidable battery on Pelican Spit, which is today known as Pelican Island, where Texas A&M Galveston is located. African-American women founded a charitable society called the Daughters of Zion right after slavery officially ended in 1866. Short references like these bear out the fact that Black men and women were very active in the life of Galveston. They just are not given equal coverage for what they did, and the identification of these persons is very poor at best. The exclusion of our history from record, allowing the inference that no one cared to note it, is criminal. Local African-American newspapers in the 19th century reported on Black community activities and participants. And although memorabilia such as printed programs from those events have often been misplaced over the years, I am certain that more records of our culture from this time exist. My grandfather had done his part, writing nightly before he went to bed. He started recording his information in 1931, a couple of years after I was born. I remember passing his bedroom late evenings and seeing Papa, as we girls called him, since this is what my mother called her father, sitting at his little desk, writing in the green composition tablet. He'd write what he remembered, then kneel down on his aged knees and pray. I would peek around the hall corner and see this every night. He'd close the door just to change into his night clothes and retire for the night. Many of his valuable memories reflected our family's long history in education. Papa began teaching in the Galveston public school system in 1883, and I left the school board in 1995, a span of 112 years in service by our family to schools in Galveston. And some of our children have continued to teach the children of Texas in other communities. The next section I'd like to read has to do with my mother's thoughts regarding Juneteenth. She has information about the origins of Juneteenth that I will omit tonight because they are things that I think are generally known by people, at least in the last 2 years when so much more interest has been shown about Juneteenth in Galveston. But she has her thoughts about why Juneteenth is important that I'd like to read this next section. She says, many younger adults have asked, what is the big deal about Juneteenth? And why don't African Americans just celebrate July 4th like everybody else in Galveston? So she refers to Mr. Hayes, who wrote a book on Galveston, who said that the first persons in Galveston to celebrate July 4th as a day of freedom were actually the newly freed African Americans. The Confederate loyal white Galvestonians were not at all happy about the Northern conquering regime taking control of their lives, giving them orders, taking away their slaves, etc. They therefore did not want to celebrate the new Union holidays. July 4th, 1776 was a date to which they felt little allegiance. On the other hand, the Galveston African Americans, thrilled with their new status and new opportunities, wanted to show their appreciation and support for this new government. Hayes says, so the African Americans paraded up and down the main streets of Galveston and may have been the first African Americans in the whole South to have an organized parade for July 4th. Dr. Elizabeth Turner, in her research, states, the only parades held on Independence Day in 1905 were provided by the African American Loyal Knights of Progress in the Hawley Guards. On that day, Blacks eulogized the contribution of Crispus Attucks, who was slain in the Boston Massacre of 1770. Dr. Elizabeth Turner continues to say, one must wonder what it meant to Black Galvestonians when they alone celebrated the nation's independence. My mother continues by saying, today's Galveston African Americans must also wonder why these people chose to celebrate the freedom of a nation from oppression when they themselves were still oppressed, mistreated, endangered. But the reason is clear when you realize the freed slaves were celebrating the freedom they had obtained due to the shift of power to the Northerners from the Southern whites in Galveston, who had fought to lead separate lives and who were not going to embrace any celebration of a union that removed their slaves from their control. This union had ushered in a new life for African Americans, even if it wasn't all worked out yet. As many of our great leaders and speakers have said, what should freedom represent for us today? Freedom from what? Now that our bodies can no longer be enslaved by others legally. We know, thanks to spirituals, that our forefathers were probably freer in spirit than we are today. That they felt themselves destined to be free, in fact, in another world. They did not feel hopeless about the next life, even if their present held no hope for them. We bear the responsibility of passing on that spirit of freedom as legacy for today's youth. My mother speaks in the next sections about these early days, that race relations were bad, but not as terrible as in other parts of the South. Largely, and I quote, because in Galveston, both races have had common enemies, the element of nature, referring to things like hurricanes, for example, and economic hard times, unquote. But she does quote from her grandfather's journal regarding securing housing. It's an interesting topic that's relevant in some ways today. She says about housing. This is from her grandfather's writing about the places that his family lived in those early years in the 1800s. We did face considerable obstacles to becoming landowners. I quote from my grandfather's writing, who described his family's move after the Civil War to Galveston. His father lived on Tremont between H and I till 1866. Those are avenues H and I. Our next home was Avenue K and 16th Street. Late in 1867, he built a house as a home on 816 Winnie Street, where we lived until 1872, when he moved his home to 1119 Avenue J. Not being permitted to buy a lot there, he moved the house to 1105 Avenue H, where he was offered a lot to buy for a home, but after remaining there from 1873 to 1879, the owner changed his mind or refused to sell the land. He then arranged to purchase a home at 915 Avenue J in 1880. In the early days of freedom, Harskull carpentered and built many houses for the ex-slaves, nearly all on leased grounds. Other accounts reinforce this, that property not only was difficult to buy for African Americans, but next to impossible to hold on to after purchase. This next section I want to read gives some background to the naming of what is now known as McGuire Dent Recreation Center here in Galveston. Many of you may know about this and others may not. And it's just my mother's, her viewpoint. She was very involved in the renaming. And this is her account of her experience of that, which relates to this whole thing about housing and the difficulty that African Americans have had even holding on to property in Galveston. She's talking about, in this section I'm going to read, being at a city council meeting when she was advocating tirelessly at many city council meetings for this change, this name change. And she says, "For this reason, it was hard to hold my temper when a misguided man challenged our effort in the late 1990s to name a city park, Menard Park, for its original owner, Robert Bob McGuire, an African American who owned much of the property in the park area. It was on that property that Galveston's Black community finally had a bathhouse that they could comfortably attend. According to city directories of that period, the land was later taken from them and used for a city park after storm-related grade raising. McGuire owned and managed a hack stand in downtown Galveston with a horse and buggy used to transport people across the city for a fee, as taxicabs do now. He earned enough money to build the bathhouse, which operated for at least a generation. All of the older residents I interviewed spoke of having such good times in his bathhouse and the hall below in the late 19th century and early 20th century. The bathhouse area where he had his businesses and homes was known by people who did not live in Galveston as the beachfront. In the days of segregation, many African Americans, both residents and visitors, thought it was the only other place they were allowed to use the Gulf of Mexico, other than at the end of the seawall at 61st Street, where one could drive down a ramp onto the sand. Since McGuire's time, the businesses on the seawall from 27th to 29th Streets have continued to be owned or at least managed by African Americans. Sadly, as a note, that was true when my mother published this book 20 years ago. It is no longer the case, but it was at the time that she published this. I undertook an effort to have 27th Street renamed as McGuire Boulevard, and to also rename Menard Park for McGuire, whose property evidently was taken from him by the law of eminent domain for the city park. The city paid him only $11,000 for the several properties that he owned. In response, the Parks and Recreation Board supported retaining the name Menard Park, but did recommend renaming the park's recreation center as the Robert McGuire Jesse McGuire Dent Center. The 1999 City Council accepted the recommendation and also voted to erect a plaque on the property to list other African American families whose homes were once on the property. One way or another, present residents need to know that the area does not belong to a few roustabouts who seem to have claimed it as a place to hang out, and that historically this is the only area behind the seawall that welcomed African Americans. White owners of businesses on the sand did not want their patrons to be turned off by the presence of former slaves in the water with them. Such owners, and sometimes even police, told them to move on, that they were not allowed to swim in those areas. People do not often go where they're not wanted, though some of our people knew all along that no one could legally keep them out. More than a mile of water into the Gulf, and all of the sand beaches belong to the state, and everyone may use the property. She continues, I remember going to the beach every evening in the summer between 8th and 10th Streets, right in the area where we lived, and on occasion going far down East Beach for all-day outings. I suppose my mother knew there was no real prohibition and also didn't look very threatening with the children she always had in tow. But I do remember my mother telling us that we didn't really want the snack food that was for sale when people built vendor stands on the sand near where we always bathed. Similarly, she discouraged us from using the playground equipment that was sometimes placed down there. Our parents tried to protect us from the ugly truth as much as they could. And we thought ourselves privileged rather than deprived because of the several things we had the neighbor children of other races didn't have, like the playhouse our father built for my sister and me. At any rate, such racial exclusion is why people today should know what happened in McGuire's day, about his success in such times. The opponent of the effort to rename the park had challenged in meetings of the Parks Board and City Council. What did this man ever do for Galveston? Mr. Menard owned a lot more property there and was the founder of the city. I countered that the very fact that Mr. McGuire held on to his property as long as he did and managed to send a daughter to college who returned as an educator to help make a better life for those still here was itself worthy of our praise. He also created a climate for our people to follow in his footsteps. He gave the African American community a place of its own and kept a lot of folk from despair by his very example of courage. Property ownership in Galveston was very elusive in those early days of the 20th century, and so African Americans placed more importance on it than many do now. Ownership is more important to those who have difficulty accomplishing it. From one book about the back alley houses and businesses of Galveston by Ellen Beasley, one might get the mistaken notion that most African Americans lived in Galveston's alleys. Not. Although a lot of our people lived in those houses, many who were domestic servants for the people in the front houses, a lot more owned their own homes, many on the front streets of Galveston. Although I contributed to Beasley's book myself, detailing the businesses that some of our folk had in rear houses, and I recognize the veracity of the reports she obtained from other residents, her book was not about property ownership by all of our people. As any Galvestonian who's over 60 years old can tell you, African Americans owned quite a bit of land in Galveston, and much of it has been lost as they moved away or passed on without heirs to continue the upkeep and pay taxes. Next, I'd like to read my mother's words about one of the early Black politicians in Galveston. There were actually two that are especially notable. I think one is probably much more well known to others in town, Norris Wright Cuney. We do have a recreation center named for him, and he did some amazing things he was nationally known. But there's another man whose name is not as well known that I'd like to read her passage about. And his name was George T. Ruby. George T. Ruby was born in New York in 1841. He first worked as a correspondent for a Boston newspaper. Ruby and the newspaper advocated complete separation of Negroes from whites in the United States. The start of the Civil War brought Ruby back to the United States from an assignment in Haiti. He arrived in New Orleans in January 1864 and began working toward the education of freedmen as the principal of an elementary school. Soon he was appointed school agent for Louisiana. In this position, he visited and established schools throughout that state. In 1866, George Ruby moved to Galveston to continue his work in Negro education. He established the Galveston Standard paper in 1871, and the newspaper was issued semi-weekly through 1873. Accounts by other newspapermen gave him credit for a neat-appearing journal. He soon became involved with politics in the Republican Party in Texas. He was active in organizing Negroes to vote Republican. The Republican Party was influential in Texas throughout the Reconstruction period, although factions within the party disagreed over its aims and goals. Ruby was active in a radical segment of the party that worked to prevent Texas from returning to antebellum practices. And I just want to pause from reading my mother's book to just say, for any of the perhaps younger people who maybe haven't studied this yet, the Republican Party was very different from today. It was the party of Lincoln, who had, of course, written the Emancipation Proclamation, and it was the one that was most involved in helping the newly emancipated persons of African descent to be able to move on and have opportunities. And so this was the party that most Black people joined or voted for. But back to her book. The first African-American congressman from Texas, Ruby, was twice elected to the state Senate during the early 1870s, where he was active in a variety of committees. He actively pursued civil rights issues in the legislature. During his political career, George T. Ruby, this African-American man in Galveston, introduced the bill into the legislature that incorporated the city of Galveston. He also helped to get tax exemptions for educational and religious organizations, which had a huge impact in relation to the University of Texas Medical Branch, UTMB. He was also one of the leading forces in getting a free public school system created, not only for the Black children, but for the white children. In 1873, the Democrats took control of the Texas Senate, and Ruby's influence was reduced greatly. In 1874, he returned to New Orleans. So I read those things and I marvel, and I think it's so important for us all to know. We often say that young people need to know, but older people who don't know need to know also. We all need to do that. But before I leave the subject of politics, I'd like to read another section in my mother's book. From the time of the Emancipation Proclamation to the 1900 storm, 42 African American men served in the Texas legislature. Ruby of Galveston was among them. Another man, W.H. Holland, among other noteworthy work, sponsored a bill in 1875 to establish Prairie View State College. The last African American to serve in that century, Robert L. Smith, left the legislature in 1899. In 1902, whites regained enough control to pass the infamous poll tax as a requirement for voting. The attempt to discourage, even prevent African Americans from voting is well known. And here in Galveston, instead of joining hands with their darker sisters, white women even used the poll tax to advance the women's suffrage movement over the right of both Black men and Black women to vote. Dr. Elizabeth Turner had the courage to reveal this in her research. Quote, "In the meantime, Southern states began their systematic campaign to disenfranchise Black voters, ending with the poll tax in Texas in 1902. Texas women supported the poll tax through the Texas Federation of Women's Clubs, which endorsed it and educated women to its advantages. The tax, they argued, would improve the electorate and purify the ballot by removing poor Blacks, poor whites, and Mexicans from voting." Close quote. My mother continues, "I remember so well when this group forced my mother's organization, the Texas Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, of which she had been president for 5 years to change their name after over half a century of good works. They were challenged in a court of law just because of this other association's claim that the name was too much like a derivative of its name. And so the name was changed to the Texas Association of Colored Women's Clubs. I thought I might kind of shift gears at this point, coming into the 1900s when my mother was growing up. Not everything in her book was super serious. One of the parts that I enjoy a lot is a funny story. By the way, I could not hardly read, everything in my mother's book. It's over 400 pages long. But I would like to read an excerpt from when she was growing up. And she was attending Central High School. I'm sorry, I didn't have this page. Give me just a moment. Okay, 3:30. So this was in the 1940s now. And for those who may remember this from your history, the 40s, when the World War II was going on, there were all kinds of things like shortages and rations and air raids that would be practiced. And so breaking into my mother's story here, she says, back to the air raids, it may have been disappointing for an adventure-loving teenager that the Japanese didn't decide to bomb Galveston, or that the Germans did not think Galveston qualified for a submarine battle. But it was surely a relief for a city with rusting Civil War cannons on the each beachfront as its protection against submarines, and aging, leaky light window shades as protection in air raids. That teenager, speaking of herself, did try to aid the war effort once by making rubber. I nearly burned down Central High School in the process. As a 14-year-old high school senior, I was the baby of my chemistry class and tired of not being noticed most of the time. Mr. Hall Dansby, who told us that his name was really Hell Dansby because he planned to give us hell unless we learned everything he could teach us about chemistry, was my most able instructor. He had a very wry sense of humor and could tell you something funny every few minutes while you were working on a lab project. But he wasn't given to silliness, and he never joked about his work. He gave accurate and detailed but terse commands about how you were to proceed with an experiment in a clear, moderate tone voice. Told you to carefully read your assignments and gave any test or exam that he promised. If a person was careless, forgetful, or just not properly self-motivated to study, that person failed the course. So he had a reputation that caused me to study at home for the first time in my life. After a semester of devoted study of chemistry, I felt secure enough to join his camera club, where we learned to develop pictures, make enlargements, etc. And I'd do any projects that gave extra credit. Just as a challenge, I already had a top grade of 1 in his class. We received number grades from 1 to 5. I decided to take part when he asked if we would like to make any substance in a book of experiments that he had from chemicals in the storeroom. When I looked through the book, I was fascinated by the recipe for making rubber. Here we were in wartime, with everyone wishing he or she could buy new tires, and we did not have many other commonly used items that contained rubber. This was before plastics, such as curlers and toys. Well, after I received Mr. Dansby's approval and organized my supplies, I excitedly went to work. Now, Mr. Dansby had a nickname for each of us. The more he liked you, the more he called you by this slightly degrading nickname. His way of showing affection was to keep a straight face and say something slightly derogatory while patrolling around the classroom. As he wandered up and down the aisles between our stations and tables, softly whistling his little tunes, we all seemed to be in control. Knowing I didn't want to seem too juvenile before my classmates, he would nonetheless call me Baby Fedford. How you doing, Baby Fedford? Fedford. Knowing his style, my classmates didn't even look up from their work. He would get on their case immediately if they did anyway. What you looking at, Rockefeller? Want to do a little extra work, huh? He would have said if anyone had wanted to tease me. So they didn't. It was a warm, family type class environment, but we were definitely challenged. For a minute, my mixture was just gently bubbling in the little beaker over the Bunsen burner. I stirred it again with my little glass rod slowly and sighed. A loud yipe was heard just below the window near me. It came from some students on the grounds below who were on a break while we were in class. It was just enough to divert my attention for a moment. Others were looking out the window too, when somebody inside yelled, "Fire!" I looked back inside just in time to see my mixture, which had boiled over, run down the side of the vessel and quickly along the table countertop, flames rising higher from it as it passed the Bunsen burner flame. 2 more seconds as I stood transfixed, and the fire alarm sounded and people ran from the building, pushing me ahead of them. I was out on the sidewalk, wondering what had happened before I realized that I had caused all of this. The feeling of absolute doom took over my body, and I began to tremble like a son of a gun. With extreme difficulty, I made myself look up to the window in the room from which I had just come. I could see Mr. Dansby's shoulders leaning over, busy putting out the fire. We returned to the room shortly. I don't know how my legs made it back up there by themselves. I know I didn't direct them. And I saw Mr. Dansby still raking the mess back into the sink, partly with his bare hands. The man was Herculean, cool, superhuman. I tried to melt into the wall, but it wouldn't happen. "Fedford, come here." "Yes, sir," I mumbled. I was waiting for the ceiling to fall in any minute now. I went to his side. "Feel this stuff. You got yourself some real rubber. Feel it," he urged. I managed to get my fingers around some of the burned product. It was elastic. He meant it. I had made rubber. He said nothing else to me, just whistled his tune between his teeth and told everybody else to shut up and get back to work. Everyone was back to normal while I just stood there gaping and waiting on him to dictate my punishment. He didn't even send me to the office. And no one from the office called over the loudspeaker to ask what had happened. I think they were told where the fire was and knew he would take care of whatever the problem was. That's one of the first times that I seriously knew for myself that there is a God. How else could you account for my going without punishment and not even much teasing from my peers? I think they actually forgot all about me after class, but not Mr. Dansby. I was entering the room the next day, still very tremulous, when Mr. Dansby asked me where all my new materials were and why I hadn't started my experiment. "Sir?" I said incredulously. He replied, "I said, get going, Fedford." Since I could tell that he was definitely not kidding, I ventured a question of my own. "What should I do, Mr. Dansby?" Speaking quickly as though he were irritated with my question or indecisiveness, or both, he repeated, "I said, get your stuff together and do it over, Fedford." "Mr. Dansby, you really want me to do it again? Yeah, you bet. Now get on it." And with that, he was through. He had every confidence that I not only could get my nerves together to do it, but that I would not dare make a mistake this time. And I didn't. The experiment went perfectly. I wrote it up correctly and everything. Only one problem. It wasn't elastic like the first batch, the burned batch. The first stuff was really rubber, and I could have saved military lives or bought some good tires by exchanging my material for rubber tires, like the bacon grease for butter, or And then I stopped daydreaming immediately for fear I was about to cause some other major catastrophe. That's my war story, or it almost was. So, as I said, there are so very many other things that I could read here. I think I'd like to read just one more that my mother calls Solidarity and Leadership. As stated before, Galveston in origin was naturally integrated. It was when laws of segregation were passed and enforced in 1885 that the churches, schools, and most public buildings were then separated by race. It was a condition born in absurdity. Mrs. Amelia Curtis, a friend of my mother's, recalled how often they sat alone in the otherwise empty balcony for Galveston Opera House performances, even those by Black entertainers. What a colossal waste of money it was to keep anyone else from sitting with them. And what courage and love of the arts these ladies had to pay to sit in isolation to enjoy the music. But it was a condition that gave birth to solidarity. In these times of segregation, unity within the African American community only grew due to the spirit of the Galveston African American. There was no irony in the timing of this community's emergence. It was because of our poor treatment that we pulled together more. The average person facing segregation did not expect anything else from those who opposed him. And so we more or less ignored whites and built our own world. As a child who grew up in this atmosphere, I can say honestly that we never even thought about white culture, although we were familiar with it. It was part of the landscape, much like the everyday view of fish jumping out of the Gulf. You don't really notice them unless you want to fish, or you enjoy sitting and watching sea life, or you're checking for signs of a storm. In this case, a storm of racial trouble. As a community within a community, we learn to laugh, cry, plan, work, celebrate within our own means. When we were yet children, encircled by the love of family and friends, we felt we had everything we needed, for we did not miss what we never had. But as adults, we did not accept segregation and a downsized way of life. Just as Adam and Eve were no longer happy being naked once they ate from the tree of knowledge and their eyes were open. The difference, however, is that Adam and Eve truly lacked nothing they needed. We continued to support the growth of our community, even as we lifted our voices to call for the end to the limits our community faced. So, let's see. Tarina, how are we doing on time? I can't hear you. I can't hear you.
Thank you. So I know that most of our readings have been 6 to 7, but if you're open to sharing from Pipsqueak, what is the name of it? Or if you have any selections from that,
Okay.
I'd love to hear them. Or if a different day is better, that's fine too. It's the ball's in your court. It's completely up to you.
Okay. Well, I tell you what, if I could read maybe one selection from each of her other books, would that be okay?
That would be really wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So the second book that my mother wrote is Divine Light Never Goes Away. And it's mostly poems and prose, short essays, and that type of thing. She has lots of poems here that I really like. But I think I'll read the one called The Rearview Mirror. And this particular one, The Rearview Mirror, she says, was written actually on my sister's 26th birthday in 1992. As I look into my mirror, traveling along the way, I watch the road I've traveled unfolding day by day. The sunlight is before me, shining on my goals. The presence all around me, clearing skies will now unfold. but I have to watch behind me, notice what effects will be. My hand must guide the wheel, steady me so carefully. I know where I'm going. I know where I have been. The traffic moves in rhythm. Indecision is a sin. You must keep a forward movement in a pattern of your own, but watch the rearview mirror or you'll wind up much alone. I know I'm doing better than I've ever done before. No worries on my highway, no trouble at my door. I've left the pain behind me. The grief is way back there. I know that God has blessed me with love beyond compare. But I watch the rearview mirror, thanking God for every mile. It's the birthday of my baby, and she's traveling in style. Like the scenes I see behind me, moving to obscure, we know today's on loan. With faith, the past informs us, prepares us for the test. The future can be scary. With God, we'll do our best. Keep looking down the highway. Believe in God and you. Control your forward movement, but mirror your rear view. And let's see, her third book, also of poems and prose and short biographical sketches, is called I Know That's Right. And again, there are so many to choose from. I think I'll read God's Swimming Pool. God's Swimming Pool. This is a poem she wrote after she and her sister went to the beach one day when they were in the 70s. My mother had only one sibling, her sister, Florence Fedford Henderson, who was 5 years older than her. And so this is a poem she wrote after they went to the beach together in their 70s. God's Swimming Pool. So we finally got together, just the two of us. Mother's only fruit, her own two little girls, who used to go out to the beach with her every evening during the summers of our childhood. Now free of responsibilities, scheduled duties, children, husbands, memory. Now, what was I about to say? Oh, well, isn't it a beautiful day? The older sister had told the younger, yeah, the water really is calm and pretty today, but I don't think so. I don't really feel up to all the trouble of putting on swimsuit, collecting things needed for comfort, walking down to the water, bending my knees. I don't feel like it. 10 minutes later, hi, my knees do feel better after they're in the water. Let's go. My son, so into his mature years, comments, oh, I think that's so cute. You two sisters going around doing things together, with an impish grin. After a look at me, he says, no, really, I don't ever think of telling my sister, let's whatever, unless our kids want to do something. I get a little dewy-eyed and tell him, one day, after much is said and done, you'll know how blessed you are if you still have two sisters to share your time, who know you so well, you don't have any image to have to project. So here we are, two youthful sisters in our 70s, trying to remember how long since we went into the Gulf water, just the two of us, if ever. Looks like a lake, so still for our versatile Gulf. Soft breezes, children playing nearby, calm that belies the troubles in our world. The younger asks, still don't want to get down? I'll help you. Then, watch me while I float. I don't want to drift too far with the current. Refreshed, they begin to long for easy chairs, being in clean clothes again. This was like having our own private swimming pool at no charge, with so many memories surfacing out here. And yet we can still go home and see our progeny and marvel at how time flies by. Generation slides into generation. It takes us a bit longer to climb the stone stairs to the seawall these days. I dimly remember racing her up the stairs. But we've had one more dip in God's swimming pool. So since the time is late, I won't read from her children's book, but I would like to just tell you about it, a little bit about it. Pipsqueaks and Zoom is a story of these three mice who live in Galveston, and they have all kinds of adventures. And just a short version of the summary of how she happened to write her only children's book is that these were stories she would tell my sister Cheryl, bedtime stories. And she says she would be sleepy, so sleepy that she'd fall asleep, and Cheryl would wake her up and say, "What else happened next?" But she would tell her about all these adventures. And then when Cheryl grew up, married, and had children, Cheryl would tell those stories to her sons. And when my mother would visit, they would say, "Grandma, tell us a story." And then I think it was my nephew Samuel who said, "Grandma, you should write these down." And so she did decide to do this. So this was the last of her books she wrote. I think this one was published in about 2009. And what's interesting about it is that the illustrations, such as what you see on the cover, were done by her grandchildren when they were children. These are, I'll just show the front and the back. So some of them were done by her grandsons, my sister's sons, and some of them were done by my daughters as well when they were all children. And then there are also just some stock photos in here, that are stock pictures that my mother took off the internet. So that's the fourth of her books, and it's and with that, I will wrap it up.
No, I want to thank you so much, and I just thank you so much for sharing the work of your mom, and just I really love the love and the energy and the connection that you bring when sharing her words, and so it's truly a gift to be here and get to witness it. I don't see any comments or questions, and I know that we're running full on time, and so I do just want to close out with one question
Okay.
for our Q&A. And that would be for the people who pick up your mother's books to read, whether it's her poetry or Island of Color or her children's book. What would you say your hope is that they get out of it? What would you say your biggest hope is for her readers that haven't experienced her words yet?
Well, I would say for the Island of Color, I know that it was her passion that the knowledge get out there, that people would know about and acknowledge and honor and celebrate the rich history of what African Americans have contributed in Galveston and from Galveston. Because some of the impact were people who were from here but went on and did other great things even across the country, such as Jack Johnson, the first world heavyweight champion, that kind of thing, who grew up here. So I would want that. I would want people to have that information because it's rich, and much like her analogy of the photographs that are faded, the history is incomplete if you don't know these things. And as for her poetry, I think it's just interesting to see her vantage point. My mother had a very unique and creative gift, and I think you would just enjoy the poems and stories, just to kind of know, what some of her thoughts were and what some of those times were that have passed. So
thank you for that. And a big thank you to everyone who joined us tonight, for everyone who's followed us along with this series. It's been really, really meaningful to just revisit and learn and strengthen our love for literacy and appreciation and learning our local Black authors and the things that they've left behind and that we're still being gifted with. And so, June, thank you again for joining us and agreeing to be here. And I just want to wish everyone a good night. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure. Good night, y'all.
Good night.